cognac distillery, you'd see a lot of grapes. If we were at a tequila distillery, you'd see a lot of agave. Y'all can get huddle a little bit closer around this jar here. Here at Barr Hill, you're gonna see a lot of honey. And this is what about 650 pounds of raw honey looks like.
Oh, wow.
And we use about 200,000 pounds a year. So this is not our only drill. Honey has it, so this is raw honey, never been filtered or pasteurized or heated. It has a natural way of filtering itself. So you see on the top layer, we have little bits of probably some old flowers, beeswax, there's pollen, propolis, a lot of good stuff. And as you kind of scrape back that top layer, you get into that really beautiful kind of gold, liquid gold. So everyone's welcome to taste right out of the jar. And it's all edible. The top part is a little more beeswaxy. Inside the golden, you can kind of see. This is that top layer is crystallized because it's seen a little bit colder temperature.
Thank you.
Everyone's good? It's really floral. Really representative.
That's incredible. Tastes like flower.
Yeah. Right. Really good.
Crystallized powder, really good.
Crystallized
Wow.
really good.
Incredible.
We actually had a honey sommelier, believe it or not, from Italy that was here a few months ago. And she was saying that the way honey crystallizes is a sign of quality. Sometimes you get those jars where they're really liquidy on top and there's just a couple chunks on the bottom that crystallize, a little bit lower quality. The fact that this is all crystallizing in that very consistent way of one layer is a good sign, according to her. So it's good to know. Here I like to show this quote on the wall. If not with milk and honey, certainly this land overflows with gin and whiskey. It was a quote from 1811 in a newspaper. And it was basically, it was a town in Beecham, Vermont that was only a few hundred people. They had about 26 distilleries. And one of them burned down. And this quote is basically saying, don't worry, we'll be okay. Even if the one distillery burned down, we've got plenty of gin and whiskey. The idea is that in that town there was probably about 26 farms. And that distillation was always on that line of farming. So imagine if you're growing apples, you sell the apples as is, then you make apple pie for a value-added product, or apple sauce, apple cider, then hard cider, and that ultimate form of preservation would be distilling that hard cider into apple brandy, something that doesn't go bad over the winter, something you can sell over the winter or consume. So that idea that distillation is separate from farms is a relatively new age concept. It used to be just kind of part of the process of processing your goods. So we'd like to remind folks of that. I can turn your attention to Phyllis is her name. She's from Germany. Phyllis was Brian's grandmother's name. Brian's the head distiller and president of the company. The real Phyllis was not too excited that her grandson was in the booze business, but we think she'd be pretty happy when she find out that we made about 45,000 gallons of hand sanitizer with this machine during the pandemic. We didn't have it in our own location, so for the longest time we made more hand sanitizer with Phyllis than we made anything else, but it was a really good learning opportunity for us. Kind of a Swiss Army knife of distills. We don't always use all the elements. Depending on what we're distilling, we can kind of pick and choose. So let's get a little bit closer. So the vodka starts with the honey. We take all the honey, we put it in one of those, they're called a fermentation tank. You'll see that in breweries or wineries. Honey, water, and yeast. So yeast are little like fungi organisms that basically eat any sugar and turn it into alcohol. And so then we're creating a fermented beverage. So we're creating a honey wine or a mead. Yeast can only live up to about 17% alcohol. That's why you'll never see a beer or a wine higher than that, because the yeast will kill themselves off. And so a naturally fermented product can only go to about that high. So we take that honey wine that's about 17%, we'll put it in here first, the pot still. This is a technology. Column stills around the 1700s, a little bit newer, but still pretty old. And the whole idea of trying to figure out, normally that big fan's not blowing like that, but the whole process of distillation is taking something that already has alcohol in it. You need to start with something that already has alcohol, like wine or beer or mead, etc. And then imagine putting it on a stove and heating it up slowly, and those first vapors to evaporate are the alcoholic vapors separating from the non-alcoholic vapors. The process is then trying to capture that vapor, turn it back into liquid, and then you have alcohol. If you were to take hard cider and put it outside in the middle of the winter, the opposite would happen, right? The water would freeze and the alcohol would not freeze. You'd be separating those two. Similar process that we're doing with heat. So for the vodka, we throw it in here for the first stripping run to make it come out to about 35% alcohol, just the pot still. Then once that comes off, it'll run through the column still. All of the rules dictating on what you can call vodka are kind of forcing the distiller to make it as neutral as possible. So for example, you need to distill it twice, minimum. Every time you're distilling something, you're making it more and more neutral, more and more like pure ethanol, and less like whatever it came from. And so it's funny to see a lot of vodka producers kind of show off and say, distill 12 times or distill 22 times. In their mind, they're pitching that they're making a cleaner product or a smoother product. But in reality, they're making just a less and less flavorful product. And if they're starting with potatoes or corn or something, then they don't really care because those things don't taste like much to begin with. We're starting with a beautiful, the best, most amazing sugar source, no offense, maple syrup, to our knowledge, which is raw honey. So we're trying to preserve it as much as possible. So we still have to distill twice. But we still have to distill to a really high proof to start. So we're just distilling, and so 200 proof is 100% alcohol, right? You have to distill to 195 proof. And you need a machine, like you need a column still to be able to get there. Pot still can only go up to about 130, 140 proof. So whiskeys and cognacs and brandies are made in pot stills. That's why inherently they have more flavor because you don't have to distill it to such a pure ethanol. Vodka, you still have to. So the way it works is in each one of these little plates, they're called, in these viewing plates, is basically a plate with holes in it. The smaller gases will go through the holes and make their way to the next plate. Some of them will hit the cold plate and recondense into liquid and kind of start over. So it's kind of like these little mini distillations happening in each one of these viewing chambers so that we can get all the way to 195 proof. The very first stuff that comes off of the still through one of these tubes, imagine these sorts of containers. We're using bigger ones, but these are kind of experimental. And the very first stuff will fill the first jar, the next second jar, third jar, until you have about, let's just say, 10 jars. And every one of those 10 jars, because of the faster stuff is at lower temperature because it distills off first. We call the heads. So the very beginning part of the distillation is the heads, the middle is the heart, and the last part is the tails. And the heads are bad for you, they're dangerous. It's what makes moonshiners go blind in the woods because there's methanol instead of ethanol. So the heads is very important to not use. And you start collecting the hearts. The hearts are very good and pure and clean. And then the tails aren't bad for you, but they have some interesting flavors. So we choose to maybe keep some tails, but not most of them. This whole process of where to do the distiller's cut, so they're cutting basically out the heads, they're cutting out the tails, but they have to choose where. Even with all of this technology, all of that is happening just with sensory. So the distiller's just smelling, mostly smelling, tasting a little bit, mostly smelling. They're smelling, definitely still methanol, a little less, but I can still get it in if you don't want it. If we want to start collecting now, there's definitely no methanol. And that's kind of where the science meets the art of distillation, is that that's still a human perspective of choosing when to do that. Bigger brands will keep a lot of heads in there, they'll keep a lot of tails in there, and then they'll just charcoal filter everything to filter all of that kind of bad stuff out. Meanwhile, they're filtering out a lot of flavor too. We're doing very little filtration, but we're choosing just that nice clean heads or heart portion to be able to still preserve a little bit of flavor from the raw honey. Any questions? We're going to taste the vodka now. vodka in this hot room. But a couple tricks of tasting spirits versus wine and beer that people maybe don't know is a good way to smell it is to open your mouth. Only put your nose in the glass, but breathe through your nose and your mouth at the same time. And your mouth is bringing in air that's non-alcoholic air, right? So it's kind of diluting down that air. You can smell a little bit better without burning your nostril. When you take a sip, the first one is nice to just wet your lips, lick your lips, and then put a little bit in your mouth, and then hold it in your mouth. Don't swallow right away. Hold it in your mouth, and your saliva will actually dilute it down, so that we're not swallowing 40% alcohol. We can swallow hopefully something closer to 20%, so it's a little bit more palatable. You don't burn your back. It's a really nice way to just get all the flavors without burning yourself. I was listening to like a podcast, and there was a Scotch producer, and he was saying that you have to hold it in your mouth for as long as the Scotch is old, for how many years. So if it's an 18-year-old Scotch, you have to hold it in your mouth for 18 seconds. That's a little bit too much, but it was kind of a fun thing to listen to. So there's no sugar added. We like to say it's a vodka that still has a little bit of flavor, but still staying into that category of vodka that's pushing it to still be relatively neutral. What do we think? It's got almost some sweetness.
Yeah.
Even though there's no sugar, there's a hint of sweetness. There's some vanilla, some butterscotch.
Yeah.
I get a lot of toffee. Right. Right. A little bit thicker, a little creamier in body, which I think is nice and unique. Yeah. They're not allowed to make secret take a day off. But it is relatively one person who's doing almost all of that. We have a distiller who's focused mostly on the gin. We have a distiller who's focused mostly on the vodka. They have a team that they'll taste each batch to make sure that everything goes the same. But that's a great question. That's really the science and the art of putting it together. They know and they're documenting. You know, it's not just, oh, I think it's good. You know, they have some standards and kind of set points that they're looking for. But it's a great question.
Any openings on the tasting team?
Any openings on the tasting team? Not yet, but we'll see. Yeah.
Have they done a run or an experimental one with just running into it once instead of twice? I mean, you couldn't call it vodka, but like,
Right.
honey, liquor, whatever you want to
No,
call it.
we're playing around a little bit with figuring that out. In that case, we might not even run it through the column at all. We maybe just do the pot still to preserve some flavors. There's a category of spirit that's becoming a little bit more known called Sommel, which is a little bit of what you're talking about, which is like a honey brandy or like a honey distillate without being technically a vodka. But we're still practicing that. So folks in place they're cut back there. They're done, and we're going to kind of switch backwards.